weekend, the first Star Trek movie in 9 years, Section 31, dropped on Paramount+. Did you even know there was a new Star Trek movie this weekend? Well, there was. That means it's time for a Star Trek tier ranking. While I'm talking, if you want to make your own tier ranking, I've got a link down below in the description that will take you to my tier maker. You can make your own tier ranking. If you take a screenshot of it, post it over on your Instagram stories or Twitter and tag me. I will share some of your Star Trek rankings. My list isn't the right list. It's just my list. It's just how I see this franchise, and I would love to see yours. And let's get started. We're going through these in release order, so we've got Star Trek: The Slow Motion Picture. Now, credit where credit is due. The fact that Star Trek came back in and of itself was a big, gigantic win for the fandom. But it didn't just come back, it came back with a production that was exponentially better. The model work, the VFX look amazing. I love the models and everything in this movie. There's all these long shots of the Enterprise, and I kind of get it because they look really, really good. And when you're going from what they were doing in the 1960s as a TV show to this production scale, I get it. Jerry Goldsmith's score, fantastic, obviously. It was so good, they brought it back for Star Trek: The Next Generation. The movie itself is pretty boring. I'm putting this one in the good Trek, bad movie category, where had this just been an episode of Star Trek at the runtime of an episode, it would have been an interesting concept for Star Trek. And in fact, if you know the origins of Star Trek the Motion Picture, you know that a lot of it was coming from this idea of doing Star Trek Phase 2, another Star Trek show. The script for this movie came out of those writing sessions, so it kind of was an episode of a TV show converted into a movie. But they're exploring very Star Trek-y ideas, the idea of technology forming self-awareness and turning into a life form. It's a new type of life. Very Star Trek kind of concept. The execution, and from there, it kind of loses itself, where the fact that there's not a lot of action in and of itself isn't what shipwrecks the movie. The characters all feel off. It's missing the banter, the liveliness, the joyful fun of the original show, in particular the nature of the characters. There's a couple lines here and there, but for the most part, everyone just feels very flat and joyless. And it's a movie with very little action, and it's a movie with way too many shots panning around the Enterprise, Spock slowly flying into V'ger, the Enterprise slowly going into V'ger. It just does that way too much, so it's a dull, boring movie. It's not a terrible idea for Star Trek, but it's about an episode's worth of Star Trek, not a 2-hour plus movie's worth of Star Trek, thus not all that great of a movie. Then we have Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. No reason to beat around the bush right here. This is classic Trek. Trek in cinematic form at its best. And a big reason for that is that this does not feel like an episode of a Star Trek TV show. This is a story that only works as this cinematic follow-up 15 years later. The whole movie is built around the concept that our characters are older and they've done a lot of great things, but they also might have a lot of regrets. And they intertwine a plot that pulls elements from the TV show and where they would be all these years later. It grabs onto the character arcs that we've been working with these characters, and then ties it all together with these themes. Even our big weapon is Genesis, this concept of new life. The whole movie is about life, death, looking backwards, looking forwards, and thematically pulls it all together so well, where it's our most character-based Star Trek we've had yet, while also being the most action-based Star Trek we've had yet. It's cinematic because it's a big action spectacle, but it's also very introspective and thoughtful all at the same time. And once again, I love the model work here. For me, the battle at the end of the film is one of the top 3 best space battles ever done in cinematic history. This one is very much kind of the naval version of that, whereas I would say like Return of the Jedi is another one of the best ones that's more of dogfights in space. This one's more kind of tension building. And James Horner's music in this film, as well as Star Trek 3, is my favorite Star Trek music. Then we also get Khan, a fantastic villain, who feels wronged by the hero. He feels justified in his actions because of what happened to him, and he's driven mad with rage or wrath, as the title might say. So for me, this is the best of Trek. This is classic Trek, and it feels cinematic and big. It's meant for this format while feeling like a follow-up to everything that's come before. Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. In the world of Star Trek, back in the day, people would say that the even-numbered Star Trek movies were great and the odd-numbered Star Trek movies were bad. I've always found that to be pretty ridiculous because I think Star Trek 3 is great Trek. Now, if you compare it to Star Trek 2, it's not quite as strong, and it's also not as good as the movie that follows it up, Star Trek 4. There are some plotting issues where it feels like some plot points are duct taped together. There's a little bit of like, hey, wait a minute, really the Federation wouldn't allow an admiral to do this when given the explanations given? Really, there are, I think, more obvious plot holes with the film, but on a thematic and character level, at its core, it's a great counterbalance to what Star Trek 2 was about. And the final sacrifice of Star Trek 2 from Spock, this concept of the one sacrificing his life for the many, entirely counterbalanced by the idea that his crew would be able, or the crewmates of all these years, would be willing to sacrifice their careers, their ship, their sons, in order for the hope of bringing him back. That there's some hope there. There's something very profound about that. That is the perfect counterbalance to what came before and shows just this utter dedication of the characters. Once again, it's got the action, the spectacle, but it's this kind of commitment to the characters and their relationships to one another. That to me is very powerful, very profound. And Christopher Lloyd is a crazy Klingon. There's a lot of fun to be had in that. So this is one I've always enjoyed, and it's probably the Star Trek movie that I just kind of put on in the background the most, probably by a lot. Star Trek 4, The One with the Whales, or The Voyage Home. For me, I believe one of the best cinematic trilogies in the history of all cinema is Star Trek 2, 3, and 4. Every film is very different from one another, but they also complement each other nicely and kind of complete this journey of an aging crew struggling to figure out what they really care about, what really matters to them, losing it all and regaining what they actually want by the end of it, by the time the credits roll in Star Trek 4. This movie is so fun, and Star Trek 2 is so good that it has confused the world into thinking that maybe Star Trek 3 isn't also great, because Star Trek 3 is also great. It's just sandwiched between two movies that are better. You doing Star Trek 4 after doing kind of these two heavier films in 2 and 3 is just such a great idea, such a fresh, fun spin on things that is not remotely the obvious place to take things, but in retrospect was the perfect thing to do. This is, at the time of its release and for many, many years afterwards, this was the most commercially successful and mainstream Star Trek thing that had ever been released. It was the movie that non-Star Trek fans actually went to go see because it was just a fun, fish out of water comedy that's a feel-good movie. That it's really funny at times.
But looking for the naval base in Alameda, could you tell me where the nuclear vessels are?
Are you sure it isn't time for a colorful metaphor?
Hello, computer.
Just use the keyboard.
No.
Yes.
Yeah,
No. Yes.
No.
Yes. I love Italian. And so do you.
Yes.
and they save the day, and the credits start rolling, and you're like, yeah, that was a good time. So just like a movie that just feels out of nowhere. Even looking back, it's like, what? They're saving whales, time travel, it's a comedy. What on earth is going on here? And that's exactly what makes it classic Trek. That this is not a series that is just in this one little box. It can go out and stretch into different genres, do different things, play around with time travel, and save some whales. So I love this movie. Another one that's very rewatchable and just completely classic Trek. I will say this, while I like the score on this one, it doesn't feel like a very Star Trek-y score. Like, it's real robust and lively, so it complements the movie, but it just feels so different from every other Star Trek score. And the guy that scored this movie also scored the Lord of the Rings animated movie from the 1970s, and he borrowed some of his music cues from it. So the first time I watched that Lord of the Rings movie, I was like, hey, this is the music from Star Trek 4. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. If you're like me and you like to read with your ears, not your eyes, consider signing up for a free 30-day trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. And if you do that, you get a free audiobook of your choice. I will recommend checking out The 50-Year Mission, the complete uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Star Trek, the first 25 years. There's actually 2 different volumes. One is about the first 25 years covering original Trek, and then the second one is about Next Generation and onward, the second 25 years. The 2 volumes together are almost 60 hours long, so it's an incredibly detailed history of Star Trek. If you're a Star Trek fan and someone that would watch a video like this, you want to check out both volumes, and you can get one of them for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. I did listen to both of those books last year and thoroughly enjoyed both of them as a lifelong Star Trek fan. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Now, this movie is one of the very first movies I remember seeing in the theater, and it might be my introduction to Star Trek. I do have an early memory of watching Star Trek IV and being freaked out by the probe. I don't know if that was right before watching this or right after watching this. But anyway you spin it, Star Trek V is widely regarded as the worst or one of the worst Star Trek movies, and there's a lot of strong arguments for why it is the weakest. On just purely technical levels, there's a lot of rough edges here that you didn't see in the previous Star Trek movies. On a plot level, there are ideas here that are blatantly goofy at best, to put it nicely. Shatner's direction is not nearly as professional and as Leonard Nimoy's. Ideas like Cybok strain quite a bit of credibility. All that said, for me, I'm going to throw this one into good Trek, bad movie. As ill-conceived as so much of this movie was and is, at its core, it was about the crew going on adventure into the unknown for the purpose of discovery. That is at the heart of Star Trek. Likewise, there's any number of sequences that just show the camaraderie between these crewmates. And while you get solid moments of them by the campfire,
Were we having a good time?
God, I liked him better before he died.
All right.
you also get the cringy moments of them by the campfire.
Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream.
But like, this is what was missing in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, where they just felt very lifeless almost the entire time. Here, you feel their relationships all throughout the movie. Now, like I said, a lot of issues here. On a movie level, the budget got cut. They tried to do these rock monsters that, like, literally there's a concept of rock monsters they couldn't pull off. And so they put that into the movie Galaxy Quest a decade later, which is just a fun little tidbit for the fans. But, you know, I've always enjoyed this movie more than probably most people. A lot of that's probably nostalgia. And some of that is I don't think people give it enough credit for the strong elements in regards to the crew and the cast, because all they see are the really stupid stuff about, what does God need with a starship? Like, they just remember the stupid and the cringe, and there is a lot of good in there too. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And in the case of this movie, this is one of the very first movies I remember learning about it in advance and being excited for an upcoming movie. That's basically what I do for a living now, but it all goes back to that starting excitement with Star Trek VI, now almost 35 years ago. But for me, we'll cut to the chase, this is classic Star Trek. And what specifically makes Star Trek VI classic Star Trek is it returns to the allegorical storytelling of the original series. There is obviously I've celebrated the Star Trek 2 through 4 trilogy of films, but those movies were thematically rich. There was character elements, plot elements that are very thrilling and exciting, but they weren't the allegorical storytelling the same way that the original series was. And finally, with Star Trek VI, you get this Cold War allegory that is also about prejudice, while being thematically, on a character level, about growing old and seeing how out of date, like all of these different ideas that are challenging the Federation utopia without ever breaking it, that they're still human, and humans have flaws and they have these prejudices, and the whole concept, we're working through all of that. And it does that with a very cinematic film. It has the scope and size of a movie. It doesn't feel like an episode, but it has that allegorical storytelling. It has both things in a way that I'm not really sure any other Star Trek movie balances it all the way Star Trek VI was able to. You get another great villain. You get kind of a conspiratorial aspect to it that's a lot of fun. It can be funny. There's another one of the best space battles of all time in the final one with the bird of prey that can fire while cloaked. There's a mystery involved. All of these different ingredients at the exact same time, and it felt like a fitting, proper send-off to this crew that had been around for 25 years and had been around for my entire lifetime, and we got to say goodbye, and it was like, that felt right. Like, it felt like one final lesson for them, one final, we're saving the galaxy for them, and it tied so much into what Star Trek and the Federation and Gene Roddenberry's utopia was all about. Star Trek Generations, our passing of the baton movie. And I think the movie has plenty of snappy dialogue. It can be really funny. There's a number of poignant scenes in it. And had this been an episode of Next Generation that was meant to be this kind of passing of the baton, it would have been one of the most memorable episodes of the show. But as a movie, it feels like a film just desperately searching for a plot device to get Kirk and Picard in the same space. And when the way you do that is by killing off Kirk in the intro to your film and then coming up with a very goofy fan service device to have him be in Dream World for a while that Picard can show up into, it's just like such an inherently fan fiction-y kind of concept, the Nexus. And they use this fan fiction-y, fan service-y idea as the context to kill off Kirk in a Next Generation movie without his crew around him or anything like that. To me, it just felt beneath the franchise. It felt beneath the character. I've never liked that. If you don't know, the YouTube channel that you are currently watching, its actual original username was Kirk Never Died. I came up with that years before I ever started Sean Chandler Talks About, because just an ongoing, lifelong irritation that's the way they disposed of Captain Kirk. It feels so unfitting. And so it's frustrating because it's not that this is a film devoid of entertainment value or scenes or moments that I enjoy. It's got some good Trek, but it's a bad movie. It's not the right mechanism. It was the wrong concept. If you wanted to pass the baton, this was not the way to do it. And maybe you never should have even been trying to pass the baton because the two franchises are too far apart in the timeline for it to make any sense without you just having to come up with increasingly silly gimmicks like the Nexus. And, you know, even beyond that, like, why did we have to destroy the Enterprise? Are we just having a shootout to add a little more conflict? Like, it's just, there's a lot of plotting issues where I just don't think it's a very good movie. Star Trek First Contact, a movie that learned all the right lessons from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Once again, with this movie, it is a sequel to one of the best episodes of Next Generation, the way that Wrath of Khan was a follow-up to Space Seed. Once again, it brings back one of the best villains from the show. Once again, it finds a great emotional hook and great arc for our lead character. And in the case of this one, it's Picard's greatest insecurity, the thing that just brings dread into his life and is able to take this man that is very often with few flaws. He's represented as a truly great man, and it takes this wound in him and is able to find his weakness that makes for one of the great Picard stories. I mean, it was, of course, with Best of Both Worlds and the follow-up where he's hanging out with his brother and kind of realize the humanity of Picard. And then you do that in this action movie. On the Enterprise, we have Die Hard in Star Trek with the Borg. You also have kind of this temptation plot line with Data being captured and his emotion trip being toyed with. But then, down on Earth, we have a time travel story where we're exploring First Contact with Zephyr Cochrane, which in and of itself is interesting material for Star Trek. And down on the planet, we're able to kind of have some levity into an otherwise very heavy and dark story. Throw it all together and you have a very well-rounded Star Trek story that feels big and cinematic. It's a follow-up to what came before, and it's highly entertaining. I've never connected with it as much as I do with my favorite of the original Trek films, but without question, this is great Trek, right on the border for me of being classic Trek. And if you throw it in classic Trek, I'm not going to argue with you for 1 second. I totally get it. I'm just not quite that high. Star Trek Insurrection. This film, to me, has always been a big disappointment, especially coming off First Contact that was so great. And then this, to me, just feels like a mid-tier episode of Next Generation, but with a feature-length runtime. In fact, there are episodes of Next Generation that are kind of like this. And if you kind of dive into the backstory of it, they had some ideas that were heavier versions of this story that was Heart of Darkness and going much darker and deeper directions with the story. And then they kind of just turned it into like a Fountain of Youth comedy that never really dives into the actual interesting moral dilemma at the center of the story. Like Star Trek VI, this is one of the few Star Trek movies that gets into that allegorical storytelling that kind of has those bigger ideas being explored. This one about the big power structure coming in to displace a group of people to mine their resources. So it taps into that, but it never actually dives into the, wait, there's actual moral dilemma here. There's people that are living for eternity, a very small group of people living for eternity, while they might have access to resources that could make life better for trillions of people. There's something there that's a lot more interesting and complicated than the movie that they gave to us, that just turned it into a very simplistic, the Federation is trying to displace people, which right there, you go, wait a minute, what's going on with the Federation that this is something that's actually being allowed to take place? But for me, it's good Trek in that it feels like an episode. If it was an episode, it would be a good episode. There are that allegorical storytelling, but as a movie, it doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like it never latched onto one specific tone and always has kind of felt very lackluster to me. Next up, Galaxy Quest. And to state the obvious, this is not Star Trek, but it is also great Trek at the exact same time. This non-Star Trek movie understood the franchise and the fandom better than most of the actual Star Trek movies. In fact, even in the placement right here, this is a bit misleading. It's because of the categories. A category has to be lower than other ones. It actually would be higher up on the list if I just numerically ranked these directly, because this is one of the great comedies of all time, while also just understanding at a fundamental level the sense of exploration and fun that comes with Star Trek, while diving into the fascinating behind-the-scenes dynamic of the original Star Trek cast members and understanding how Star Trek fans related to Star Trek. And they found a story that could be thrilling, exciting, adventurous, and really, really funny, and made the fans part of the people that saved the day. Just such a really fun spin twist on things. So, much like in recent years, a lot of people think the Orwell is much better than any of the recent Star Trek that's coming out. It's better Trek than actual Trek. Galaxy Quest back in the 90s was better Trek than most Trek movies way back in the day, and it remains that way. I think that this is a fantastic movie and a fantastic celebration of Star Trek while not being Star Trek. Real quick, if you're wondering where I got this Galaxy Quest t-shirt, I will have links down below in the description where you can order your own Never Give Up, Never Surrender t-shirt. Star Trek Nemesis. On paper, this movie should be really good. The main villain is played by Tom Hardy. The script was written by John Logan, who had just written Gladiator and would go on to write The Last Samurai and Skyfall, one of the most praised Bond films. But they hired the wrong director and they went in a completely wrong direction with the script that they did have. So you get a movie that's all about car chases, over-the-top action, and there's even like a rape sequence in it. According to producer Rick Berman, 50 minutes worth of character scenes were just cut out of the movie. And so it's a film that the movie that was actually released, it feels like it's all first act and third act, and the entire middle act is just cut out of the movie, and so sequences make absolutely no sense. And it tries to have all these big emotional moments with sacrifices that are copying Star Trek 2 with what Data does, but it doesn't earn any of it. It doesn't do any of the character work or thematic work to set any of that up. They introduced this idea about Shinzon doing like this rape thing with his mind with Deanna Troi. It's just like gross. It doesn't fit in Star Trek at all, and it doesn't in a meaningful way go anywhere. So you just introduce, that's too powerful of a thing to just casually have it in there. So it is like just like a disaster on every single level because there's no setup, so the payoff doesn't work. There's too many ideas, character, like all that stuff we praised on other movies about character moments and being character-based. All of that was cut out of the movie, and it's pretty funny because Marina Sirtis, National Treasure, decided to be quite blunt about it. The director was an idiot. She said it right there. The person that had the most control on the movie was an idiot that did not understand Star Trek, the genre, the script, the franchise, any of it whatsoever, and ruined the movie. This is bad Trek, and it is a bad movie. It does not work on any level. Star Trek 2009. For me, I find this to be a very enjoyable blockbuster with a Star Trek skin on it. It's bad Star Trek, but it's an awful lot of fun. Right out of the gate, it kicks off with this emotional and heroic introduction sequence of how the timeline kind of changed. That was the first movie where I ever saw Chris Hemsworth, and with very little screen time, absolutely commands the screen, sets the tone for the movie that you are watching and the weight and emotion that is possible within it. It's a fantastic little sequence. And then we kind of go off on this J.J. Abrams roller coaster. His blockbusters tend to be these very fast moving movies where he's able to stack things on top of each other where simple dialogue scenes, he'll add some conflict, there's some motion, there's action, so they move very quickly. There's a lot of entertainment value. There's always so much happening where you just feel you're riding through this blockbuster roller coaster ride that he's put together. Now, is that very Star Trek-y? Not really. Is it really fun? Yeah. And they kind of create this scenario where you turn Captain Kirk into Maverick from Top Gun, where he's got daddy issues and he's really good and he's cocky, but he's got to work through all this stuff and figure out how to work with other people. You know, how much of that feels like it's actually coming from originals Trek or anything like that? It's all kind of made up, but it makes for a fun blockbuster film. I think on rewatch, as soon as you start to think through the plot, there's too many coincidences, contrivances, taping the movie together. There's a sequence in the film where Spock, instead of putting Kirk in the brig, shoots him down onto a random planet where he happens to land right next to old Spock or Spock Prime. That's ridiculous. Like, it only happens that way because the plot has to happen. And where do they happen to run into? Scotty. I mean, this is entirely contrivances. But as a roller coaster, J.J. Abrams knows how to deliver the fun and have just the right amount of emotionally poignant films. I really do enjoy this film, even with all of its weaknesses and lack of actual Trek. Star Trek Into Darkness, as I just mentioned, J.J. Abrams makes roller coaster ride movies. Those tend to play the best in a crowded theater with lots of energy, where you're just along for the ride. But they also tend to crumble afterwards when you stop and think about them. And this movie for me is the worst example of that. When I first watched it, over 10 years ago, I had a ton of fun with it, and there's all these things I loved about it. And then I realized I never really wanted to rewatch it. And then when I did rewatch it, I was like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And the more I heard other people's criticisms, it's a movie that just absolutely imploded on itself. As Star Trek, it's ridiculous, and as a blockbuster, it doesn't hold any water. In the first 15 minutes, Kirk violates the Prime Directive, suggests the Prime Directive is no big deal, he lies on a captain's log, and then he's frustrated with Spock for not lying about what happened. And Kirk has gone against rules and done things for his reasons, but like in Star Trek 3, when he steals the Enterprise, he does it knowing the consequences because something matters more to him that's very personal, and he returns to face the consequences. He is fully aware of what he's doing and why he is doing it. Here, he's like, what's the big deal? We're just trying to do what our thing. We know, who cares? Just as like this guy that doesn't care at all. So it makes no sense that he would be the captain of a starship. As much as the last movie played it for fun of kind of that energy that he has, they just turn him into this just reckless lunatic with a starship that has no ability to acknowledge faults, has no understanding of the rules or consequences. That doesn't make for a movie that holds together. And just kind of from there, the plot just feels like them desperately trying to redo elements of Star Trek 2. But in just like the worst example of a J.J. Abrams mystery box, that they wanted to keep it a secret that Khan was in the movie. So they wrap up a story that like they're forcing the Khan stuff into it. And then you watch the movie and they treat it as a big reveal. That's a reveal for the audience, but in the context of the movie for the characters, it doesn't make any sense the way that it plays out. And then they just start mirroring plot points that aren't earned and sacrifices. And the death of Spock had weight because it cost the crew everything to bring him back in the next film. It cost them everything except their lives to bring him back. And it did cost people their lives. And in this movie, they just cheat. There's magic blood that can cure death. Just bad writing. And it's a movie that's self-aware of the fact that it's not very good. And not very good Star Trek.
This is clearly a military operation. Is that what we are now? Because I thought we were explorers.
And it keeps going down that path of ignoring what Star Trek is all about, despite knowing what they're doing. So on this one, pretty simply put, I think it's bad Trek, and it's a bad movie. It just doesn't work on any of the different levels. Star Trek Beyond, and cut right to the chase on this one. I think it's a fun enough big sci-fi adventure movie, but once again, it's bad Trek. That it doesn't seem to understand Star Trek or the characters at all. And once again, it feels like it's trying to just copy and steal plot points from much better movies without ever understanding why those plot points worked in the first place. So in particular, this movie is about a disillusioned Captain Kirk who's bored with being a captain, which is like, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit with the Captain Kirk character. This is the thing they did with Kirk in Star Trek II, that he's disillusioned. Except in that, he's 50, having a midlife crisis, and he's no longer a captain. And the whole point brought to him by Spock is that you belong as a captain, not behind a desk.
If I may be so bold, it was a mistake for you to accept promotion. Commanding a starship is your first best destiny.
So, when you're watching this movie and he's in his prime, off on all the adventures, disillusioned, it's like, where are you even going with this? What point are you making? Because it just feels like you're just mashing something in that doesn't fit with this character. So I think it's very bad Trek. And then likewise, well, it's the third movie. We got to blow up the Enterprise again. This is like just the go-to tactic. Just blow up the Enterprise again. And it happens at the beginning and it's meaningless. It doesn't, the reason that it worked in Star Trek 3 is because it was an example of how far the crew were willing to go for Spock. Here, it's just to show that the aliens have even cooler tech that can do even more damage. Look how big and explosive it is. But there's nothing thematically or anything interesting beyond that. It's just tech that can blow up the Enterprise. So, but like I said, like it's a fine blockbuster. Like just, there's cool action sequences. There's jokes that land. It moves at a quick pace. They brought in the guy that did a bunch of the Fast and the Furious movies. So it kind of plays like Fast and the Furious in space. And so it's a fun enough blockbuster, but bad Trek. And that'll bring us to Section 31, the latest Star Trek movie. A movie so disastrous that it makes Into Darkness and Nemesis and Star Trek V seem like good, solid Star Trek movies. This thing does not work on any level whatsoever. If you just take it as generic sci-fi story, it's like Mission Impossible in space with a Guardians of the Galaxy tone, but a terrible version of it, where everything is this try-hard humor. All the characters their personalities just like cranked up to 11, just being outrageously goofy and silly constantly. And so they're irritating rather than funny or charming.
You don't answer her questions directly, she will punch you in your face.
What?
You said that she was going to be doing the face punching.
On a Mission Impossible level, it's very basic. Get the team together to stop the device that'll destroy the galaxy, but none of the intrigue, the wit, the turnarounds, any of the stuff that actually makes these types of spy stories great spy stories. It's just missing. It's the most basic, superficial version of a spy story. And then, like I said, the Guardians of the Galaxy stuff is just this wild, obnoxious tone. But it's not generic sci-fi movie. It's supposed to be Star Trek. And as Star Trek, it is utterly unrecognizable. Even as a spin-off of Discovery, it doesn't feel like the world of Discovery. It has its own aesthetic, vibe, tone. There's none of the Gene Roddenberry utopia. There's no signs of like actual Federation type stuff. It's like its own little pocket thing detached from everything else. And it's such a bizarre niche concept because it's a spinoff from Star Trek Discovery, and it's adapting Section 31, this, covert ops in Star Trek introduced in Deep Space Nine. So it's like, let's take this little thing over here and this little thing over here. Let's see where the overlap of those two fandoms is, but then give it the tone that doesn't line up with any Star Trek. So it's like super niche for a very specific Star Trek fan, but also designed for no Star Trek fan whatsoever, because there's everything distinct and unique about Star Trek has been stripped away from this and replaced with this hyper edited, quippy nonsense, loud, noisy nonsense. There's nothing redeemable about any of it. There's not fun to be had as a blockbuster or just generic sci-fi, and there's no Star Trek here whatsoever. Even tonally, it starts off with a girl killing her whole family, and the next sequence is basically slapstick humor. Just nothing whatsoever here works at all. This feels like a failed pilot. They had an idea. They went, maybe this will work. They shot a pilot and they went, oh, that's terrible. And then they released it anyway. This is embarrassing for everyone involved. Nothing about it works. The one positive to come out of this is that it makes all of the other bad Star Trek movies look good by comparison. Well done, Section 31. We waited 9 years for this thing. Alrighty, look around. This is my completed Star Trek ranking. Be sure to create your own at the link down below in the description. You can get a Never Give Up shirt at the link down below in the description. And if you want to get the oral history of Star Trek for free, you can sign up for a 30-day free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler, where you can get a free audiobook. If you're a Star Trek fan, I highly recommend checking that out. All those links are down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.